You can't just expect everything to turn out the way you plan. As we all know, plans never survive first contact with the enemy. So in thinking about any follow-on force to a peace agreement, we have to do what the military traditionally does, which is not just look at what we think is likely to happen, but what the best possible outcome could be and what the worst possible outcome could be, and how we would respond in all of those circumstances. And quite clearly, there is the potential, if we're not careful about our arrangements, for us to be drawn into a subsequent conflict with Russia.
Mr. Gable, when people imagine how a nuclear war could start, they often picture a small conflict that escalates out of control. Well, conflicts don't get much smaller than seizing one tanker in the Atlantic Ocean, but the sight of American forces landing on a ship with a hastily painted Russian flag on it certainly made people wonder about the risks of escalation. So now is probably a good time, as good as any, to think about the nuclear deterrent. How do we use it to keep us safe while not allowing it ever to be actually used? The Chief of the Defence Staff from the Blair and Brown era, Lord Stirrup, Jock Stirrup, has been considering just that. He argues in a new report for the Policy Exchange that it's time to rethink Britain's nuclear deterrence doctrine for the first time since the Cold War. He joins us now. Jock, good morning to you.
Good morning, Steve.
What's wrong with the current nuclear deterrent as we consider it at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that in considering deterrence, and that's what we have to do in this increasingly dangerous and volatile world, we can't just think in terms of nuclear weapons. If we want to avoid a nuclear exchange, then we want to avoid wholesale war. And the way to do that is through deterrence in the round. Deterrence, as Sir Michael Quinlan, who we cite frequently and refer to in this report, was our greatest thinker about nuclear weapons and their use and their deterrent properties. And he made it quite clear that deterrence is not a series of sealed boxes, as it were. It's a spectrum, and you have to view it as such. So you have to look at defence capabilities in the round and how they deter any potential aggressor from ever starting a war, because that's the key to it. So the first thing is to say that it's not just about nuclear weapons. It's about our defence capability across the spectrum of operations. So it's not a question of what's wrong with our nuclear weapons or our nuclear capability. It's a question of what's wrong with our overall deterrent posture.
And that is, I presume you're going to say, and many would agree with you, that ultimately we've underinvested in the military over the last 30 years, and we still talk a good game now and still haven't necessarily ramped it up sufficiently to be sufficiently strong that we act as a deterrent to countries like Russia.
Well, that's absolutely true. And the current government commissioned a defence review led ably by Lord Robertson, which was extremely clear in setting out the kinds of capabilities that we would require in future if we were to have this spectrum of deterrence. But clearly that requires much more expenditure than is currently being planned for by the government. But it goes beyond just the acquisition of capabilities. Deterrence is a form of cognitive warfare, and it existed long before that term became popular in defence circles. And it exists in the minds of potential aggressors as much as in the capabilities you have. They have to believe that should they engage in conflict with you, the consequences for themselves would be totally unacceptable. So we need not just to invest in the capabilities, but we need to invest much more in our thinking about deterrence, in our intellectual approach to it. And that's not just in the military, that's across government and indeed across society more widely.
Is Trump quite good at that, actually? We've been talking a lot about Trump, how he, whatever we think of his lack of strategy, whatever we think of his motivations, he projects strength. He has a very, very powerful army, and at least in very tactical advancements of it, he shows that they're effective.
Well, he certainly demonstrates strength, but also in a way, his very unpredictability must raise very serious doubts in the minds of a potential aggressor what his government's response might be to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should emulate President Trump, but it's absolutely true that you must raise in the minds of a potential aggressor those very, very serious doubts about whether the consequences of any conflict would be acceptable to them.
The problem is with Donald Trump, he raises those doubts in the minds of his allies as much as potential aggressors.
Well, that's true. And of course, in the piece which Policy Exchange has just published, we make clear that this is not an issue solely for the UK. Our defence is rooted in our membership of NATO. It's clear that we do not need to possess all the capabilities required for deterrence across the spectrum of operations, but they must be reliably available to us in the event of any conflict.
How much faith do you put in America's security protocols, not security guarantees? I'm very looking at the language, actually, Jock, when it comes to what's going on in Ukraine. And America talk about security protocols when it comes to any form of guaranteed peace in the future. How much faith do you have in America's role as a good ally when it comes to, say, a situation like Ukraine?
Well, I think that if America gives a clear and solid undertaking, then we can rely upon that. The question is going to be exactly how is the undertaking phrased. But I think what's crucial is that we should not get too carried away by a single administration. And by that, I don't mean that after the Trump presidency, everything will return to the way it was, because I don't think it will. It's been clear for some time that America's strategic priorities are leaning in a different direction from Europe. And that's entirely reasonable. It's entirely reasonable for America to take its own national interests into account. What is absolutely plain is that European members of NATO need to do much more than they're currently doing in terms of their own security and their own defense. Now, there have been some significant moves in recent years along that direction, but they're not nearly enough and they're not nearly fast enough. We need to do much more as European members of NATO to look after ourselves.
And when you look at, again, with Ukraine, the coalition of the willing looks like it's going to end up as two countries, Britain and France, providing about 7,000 troops each to offer some sort of support for any peace. Is that enough? Is even that sustainable with the current state of the British military?
Well, of course, it depends, first of all, on what that force is required to do. I mean, I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. I think, actually, any peace agreement in Ukraine is a long way off.
Yeah.
Secondly, you have to ask yourself what the force is intended to do. But thirdly, and this is absolutely crucial, you can't just expect everything to turn out the way you plan. As we all know, plans never survive first contact with the enemy. So in thinking about any follow-on force to a peace agreement, we have to do what the military traditionally does, which is not just look at what we think is likely to happen, but what the best possible outcome could be and what the worst possible outcome could be, and how we would respond in all of those circumstances. And quite clearly, there is the potential, if we're not careful about our arrangements, for us to be drawn into a subsequent conflict with Russia.
Do you issue a back in harness still, Jock? Still having to do this back in command?
I had my turn and I had quite enough challenges, and we've got very capable people doing it at the moment, and I'm very happy to support them.
Good answer. Good to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
That's Jock Stirrup there, Lord Stirrup, the Chief of the Defence Staff from the Blair and Brown era.